The battlefield had long since grown silent. The crack of bolt or fire, the shriek of lost beams, the reverberation of war engines, all of it had faded into an oppressive stillness that hung over the broken earth like a funeral shroud. In the blackened ruins of a manufacturing complex, walls cratered by explosives and ceilings collapsed under their own charred weight, one warrior still drew breath. His power armor was shattered, once proud ceramite plates peeled back and scorched, the heraldry of his chapter ground into obscurity beneath the grime of battle. His helm was gone, torn from him in the melee, and the face beneath was pale with blood loss, his features locked in the cold determination of one who refused to yield. He was an Astartes, a space marine, son of the Emperor, one among the chosen who were never meant to be brought low. Yet here he was, forced to one knee amid the wreckage, his gauntlets trembling as he tried to rise again. The taste of iron filled his mouth. His vision blurred and refocused, every breath dragging promethium-tainted dust into his genetically reinforced lungs. Around him the battlefield whispered, not with the triumphant cries of his brothers, but with the clinking footsteps of those who approached, the enemy, the unthinkable. To fall in battle was no dishonor, every warrior knew that their life belonged to the Emperor, and their death was but the final tithe. But to fall into enemy hands, that was another fate altogether, a destiny so rarely spoken of that even the litanies of the chaplains avoided it. For what words could prepare a space marine for the shame of survival under chains? What scripture could justify his heartbeat when it was not spent in the service of destruction, but preserved by the malice of his captors? They came in shadows, figures both alien and heretic, their outlines shrouded by smoke. His vision caught glimpses, jagged silhouettes, the glimmer of cruel steel, the faint green glow of runes carved into armor that no forge of the Imperium would ever sanctify. They did not rush to strike him down. No, they advanced with the patience of those who had already claimed victory. Predators savoring the fall of their prey. He felt hands seize his arms, metallic claws digging through the cracks in his armor, forcing him onto the scorched ground. Chains rattled. Real chains, heavy links blackened by fire, slamming down across his wrists and chest. The absurdity of it almost broke through the haze in his mind, a space marine, bound in iron, as though such relics could hold what the Emperor had wrought. Yet his body betrayed him, refusing the command to rise, his enhanced muscles failing under exhaustion, his secondary heart pounding without strength enough to overcome his wounds. The silence of his vox-link was worse than the shackles. His brothers should have been there, voices thundering in his ear, the clipped commands of sergeants, the battle hymns recited over the clash of war. But the vox was dead, static hissing faintly in its absence. He was alone. The realization struck with a force greater than any blade. Alone. A word that no space marine was ever meant to taste. They dragged him from the ruins, each step a humiliation, ceramite screeching against rockcrete as his once proud armor became nothing more than dead weight. The battlefield opened before him, no longer a place of glory but a graveyard of wreckage. He saw the bodies of guardsmen strewn like discarded toys, their lost guns still clutched in fingers grown stiff. He saw the broken hulks of his brother's armor, cracked helms and split breastplates leaking the remnants of lives that had burned too brightly. Each sight pressed deeper into him than any blade could, the knowledge that he had survived while others had not, and that his survival was not even his own choice. In the distance, banners waved, not the twin-headed Aquila of the Imperium, but sigils daubed in blood and filth. They were trophies, proclamations of victory shouted into the heavens, daring the Emperor himself to deny them. He clenched his teeth until blood ran between them, the fury of his spirit screaming to fight, to rise, to carve his name into the enemy with one final act of defiance. But his body did not answer. The chains were too heavy, or perhaps he had already been broken more than he wished to admit. No space marine was trained for this. Every catechism he had memorized, every prayer etched into his soul, spoke only of death in battle or triumph in his name. Captivity was not spoken of, for it was not meant to exist. And yet here he was, drawn across a battlefield that had become his shame, toward a fate whispered only in fearful conjecture. The air grew colder as they moved, the shadows lengthening. Somewhere behind him, the manufactorum smoldered, its final embers fading. He would never see it again, never see the banners of his chapter raised above victory, never hear the voices of his brothers in the storm. The chains pulled tighter. The silence deepened. And within his mind, a single truth rang with unbearable clarity: for a space marine, death was not the worst fate. They brought him down into the dark. The ruined manufactorum gave way to the underworks, the long-forgotten tunnels beneath the hive that had become the domain of scavengers, heretics, and those who thrived on decay. The stench was overwhelming: mold and rust, chemical seepage, and the copper tang of old blood baked into stone. Even through the filters of his battered rebreather, the Marine could taste it, a foul blend that clung to the back of his throat. His captor's boots echoed on the rockcrete, the scrape of chains dragging behind them marking the rhythm of his descent. Each clink was a reminder that he had not been slain in battle, but spared, and not by mercy. He forced his eyes to remain open. Though his vision blurred, his enhanced senses dulled by blood loss and trauma, he catalogued every detail. Astartes' conditioning did not allow surrender, even when defeat was certain. He noted the ritual scars carved into the arms of one captor, the alien curve of another's armor, the flicker of glyphs etched into the walls that glowed faintly green with a power not born of machine or sanctioned science. He committed them all to memory. Whether he lived or died, the Emperor's servants would know what had been done here. That was his oath. That was his duty. They came to a chamber deep underground, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls slick with condensation and overgrowths of lichen fed by seepage from the hive above. Chains hung from beams like the instruments of some forgotten execution hall, clattering as though eager to taste flesh once more. The captors hauled him to the center, driving him to his knees with brutal efficiency. He tried once again to resist, to rise even an inch, but his muscles betrayed him. Wounds that would have slain mortal men had merely slowed him, but now they became 1,000 weights dragging him down. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, distinct from the others. The clamor of chains and boots seemed to hush at its presence. The Marine raised his head, eyes narrowing against the gloom. It was a man, or at least the husk of one, robed in fabrics that writhed like living things, stitched with runes that burned his vision to behold. A vox grill covered his mouth, distorting his words into something guttural and metallic, though their meaning was clear. He spoke not to the Marine, but to his followers, proclaiming victory, declaring that the Imperium's strongest had been captured, their might proven false. The words rolled like poison, meant to seep into the ears of all who heard. The Marine spat blood onto the floor, a defiance as pure as any bolt or shell. The vox-grilled figure paused, tilting its head as though studying a curiosity. Then it knelt, bringing its robed face close. The smell of incense and rot wafted from the folds of cloth, mingling into something almost unbearable. "You are not dead," the voice rasped, distorted yet clear. "That is the gift." The Marine said nothing. Silence was his weapon now, his last defense against humiliation. Yet even as he turned his gaze away, he could feel the weight of his situation pressing into him. He had been captured, shackled, dragged into the bowels of a hive by those who should never have been able to touch him. His body, unbreakable by design, had failed. His armor, once his fortress, lay in pieces. His brothers were gone, their voices silent. Time blurred. He did not know how long he knelt there, bound in chains, as the chamber filled with whispers and the scrape of tools prepared for use. The captors moved about with the patience of carrion feeders, not rushing to devour their prey, but savoring the knowledge that the feast was inevitable. The Marine's breathing grew heavier, his secondary heart straining to maintain him. In the silence of his mind, prayers formed, not spoken aloud but etched within the discipline of his soul. He recited the canticles of endurance, the litanies of hate, fragments of chapter catechisms that reminded him who he was. Not a man. Not a slave. A space marine. A servant of the Emperor of mankind. But even prayer did not banish the truth. His fate was no longer his own. He was not dying a glorious death in the Emperor's light, but lingering, chained, in the dark. And though he fought to ignore it, a whisper of fear began to stir. Not for death, that was no fear at all, but for what might come before it. Above, the hive city burned in silence. Below, in the shadows, the shackles tightened. The first strike came not from a weapon but from the sound of machinery. A great engine somewhere within the chamber groaned to life, its gears grinding against stone, its power source emitting a dull thrum that vibrated through the floor. The light changed, flickering between green and red as arrays of alien lamps sputtered into existence along the walls. Their glow was not steady, but pulsing, as though mimicking a heartbeat. The shadows stretched and recoiled, and in their wake the instruments of torment were revealed. Tables lined with restraints. Blades that were not shaped by any human hand. Hooks designed not for butchery but for harvesting. Cables ended in syringes or spines, ready to pierce. In another life, in another place, the Marine might have dismissed them as crude tools, nothing compared to the artistry of imperial technology. But here, with his body broken and his chains biting into his wrists, he saw them for what they were, implements of desecration, carefully arranged for him. The robed figure raised a hand, and his captors dragged the Marine forward. He resisted, planting his armored boots against the floor, forcing them to strain against his immense weight. Even wounded, even half-dead, the flesh of a space Marine was a fortress. They grunted with effort, muscles and servos straining, and for a moment he allowed himself the bitter satisfaction of knowing he still required many hands to move. But the chains were relentless. They pulled, they tightened, and at last he stumbled forward, slammed down onto a slab of cold metal. The restraints locked in place, pinning his limbs, crossing his chest, holding his head fast against the unforgiving surface. He strained against them, tendons in his neck rising, veins bulging as he tried to tear free. His muscles burned, the augmentation in his body screaming to be unleashed, but the wounds, the exhaustion, and the sheer weight of his captors pressed him down. He roared, not in fear, but in fury, a sound that shook dust from the ceiling and sent the lesser men recoiling. The robed figure did not flinch. He simply inclined his head, as though studying an interesting specimen in a jar. The Marine remembered the words of his chaplain, "To fall in battle is to rise in eternity. To fall in chains is to fall into silence." The words had always seemed distant, a warning too abstract to be real. Yet here they were, carved into his soul as truth. He thought of his brothers, of the oaths sworn upon his initiation, of the purity seals that once adorned his armor. Each memory was a weapon, and he clung to them with the ferocity of a drowning man clutching wreckage. But memory did not loosen the chains. The robed figure leaned close, speaking in that vox-distorted tone once more. The words were not for understanding but for corruption. They were a mockery of the imperial tongue, half-recognizable prayers twisted into profane echoes, half-whispers in a language that no human should hear. The Marine felt them reverberate in his skull, as though the syllables themselves were claws scratching at his mind. He clenched his jaw, grinding teeth until blood welled anew, refusing to let even a flicker of response show in his eyes. Pain followed. Not the clean pain of battle, not the righteous agony of wounds suffered for the Emperor, but the slow, deliberate cruelty of captivity. A blade slid beneath a cracked plate of his armor, prying at the seals, exposing flesh to the cold air. He did not cry out. Another tool, some fusion of metal and bone, pressed against the scar of his gene seed implantation, probing, testing. His body convulsed, but his voice remained silent. They would not have his scream. Yet the worst pain was not physical. It was the sound of their voices, the way they spoke of him as though he were already an object, a thing to be unmade and studied. They spoke of the gene seed as a prize, of his organs as curiosities, of his body as an offering. He was no longer a warrior to them, no longer a son of the Emperor. He was prey, bound and catalogued, his destiny rewritten in whispers. The restraints bit deeper. The chamber's light pulsed faster. And though his mind raged and his soul thundered in defiance, a question began to fester, cold and poisonous: if he survived this, what would remain of him? The chains did not answer. Only the machinery did, groaning louder, promising that his fate had only just begun. The hours, or perhaps days, blurred together. Time had little meaning beneath the earth, where there was no sun to rise or set, only the pulse of machinery and the flicker of alien lamps casting their diseased glow. He endured each moment as a separate battle, his body tightening under the weight of restraint, his mind retreating into the fortress of oaths and prayers etched into his soul since the day of his ascension. Yet even a fortress may crack, and every new violation sought to drive a wedge deeper into him. They stripped away his armor piece by piece, not with reverence, but with the joy of desecration. Ceramite plates that had been blessed in the name of the emperor were pried away, thrown into heaps like scrap. The aquila upon his chest, sacred symbol of the Imperium, was torn off and held aloft in mockery before being tossed into the dirt. He could not stop them, but he could fix each act in his memory, burning the image into his mind as something to be repaid if ever freedom came. Each theft, each insult, each scar would be avenged. His captors were meticulous. They examined every scar upon his flesh, every augmentation beneath his skin, every beat of his reinforced hearts. Tools pierced him, siphoned blood into flasks, extracted tissue samples with the precision of artisans. He endured it in silence, every nerve alight with pain, every muscle convulsing against chains that refused to yield. Pain was no stranger to a space marine, his life had been forged in it. Yet this was not pain in service of strength or trial. It was degradation, a reminder that his body no longer belonged to him but to the hands that had claimed it. What he feared most was not the touch of their blades, but the whispers that followed. Their words seeped into the air like toxins, crawling into the spaces between thoughts. They spoke of the Imperium as a corpse, of the Emperor as a rotting husk, of loyalty as a shackle more binding than iron. They told him he was abandoned, forgotten in the void of war, a tool discarded by masters too distant to hear his prayers. They told him that his brothers had not died, but had been left to rot like him, their sacrifices unnoticed, their names unrecorded. He resisted, he recited litanies, he filled his mind with hymns, but still the words pressed in, like water against a sealed bulkhead, seeping through hairline cracks. He dreamed, if it was dreaming. Memories twisted in the half-sleep forced upon him by blood loss and exhaustion. He saw the halls of his chapter's fortress monastery, but the banners were defiled, dripping with rot. He heard the voices of his brothers, but they spoke with the accents of his captors, their prayers turned into curses. He reached for his bolter, but his gauntlet grasped only chains. The vision dissolved into darkness, and in the darkness he heard laughter, low, cruel, and endless. When he woke, the torment resumed. Needles pierced him, pumping unknown fluids into his veins, burning with alien fire. His vision swam, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw the face of his chaplain, leaning over him with words of strength. But then the visage warped, the flesh splitting to reveal a demon's grin beneath, and he knew it was another trick, another assault not upon his body but upon the sanctum of his mind. The marine's defiance did not break, but it bent. He began to measure victories not in freedom or triumph, but in silence. If he did not scream when they cut him, that was victory. If he did not respond when they taunted, that was victory. If he could cling to even a single memory of his chapter's glory, untwisted and untainted, that was victory. Yet these victories were fragile, momentary, and he could feel them eroding with each passing trial. And still, beneath all the agony, the humiliation, and the slow dissolution of certainty, a single truth burned within him: he was a space marine. Captured, yes. Shackled, yes. Broken? Not yet. Not while even one breath remained in his chest. Not while his mind could still form the Emperor's name. But he knew, in the quiet moments when the captors left him hanging in silence, that his fate had diverged forever from the path his life was meant to walk. Death had been denied to him. What waited in its place was a fate the Imperium would never record, and one his chapter would never sing of. The chapter of his captivity had only just begun. The chamber of torment was not a place of chaos. It was not a battlefield, nor the aftermath of one, where blood and bodies lay strewn in savage testament to the fury of war. No, this place was crafted with intention, ordered with an artistry that spoke of patience and purpose. Every chain, every slab, every cruelly fashioned device had been placed with care. To his captors, this was not barbarity. It was craft. It was study. It was worship. The Marine soon learned the rhythms of this new existence, though he never called them life. They came in cycles, not by the sun or stars, for neither pierced the depths, but by the engine's hum and the rituals of his tormentors. At times, he was left in silence, suspended in darkness, the only sound his own labored breathing and the echo of dripping condensation. At others, the chamber erupted in activity, its walls alive with glyphs, its captors descending upon him like carrion beasts, their tools gleaming in the sickly light. They cut into him with precision, never wasting motion. To them, his flesh was not flesh but material, sacred in its uniqueness, yet not beyond desecration. The gene-forged organs of the Adeptus Astartes were of immense value. His captors probed them all, the reinforced bones of his skeleton, the reinforced lungs capable of filtering poison, the Laraman's organ that sealed his wounds almost as soon as they were inflicted. They recorded every reaction, every twitch of his body, with devices that hissed and clicked. When they bled him, they caught each drop in vials, as though it were the ichor of a god. He endured, though endurance no longer felt like triumph. Each incision, each intrusion into his sacred biology, was a theft against not just his body but his very oath. He was crafted for war, for the Emperor's wrath, not to be carved open beneath the eyes of enemies who spoke his undoing as liturgy. Yet every breath he drew was still defiance. They had not unmade him. Not yet. The worst came when they sought to pry from him what words could not give. His gene seed, the twin progenoid glands that ensured the continuation of his chapter's line, was the greatest prize they could harvest. He felt them searching for it, knives circling dangerously close to those sacred repositories. They did not take it, not yet. No, they relished the anticipation. They whispered that it was his destiny, that one day soon his very essence would be theirs, consumed by the dark gods, replicated into mockeries that would stain the stars. He swore within himself that they would not have it, though he had no control over the hands that sought it. Between torments, they spoke to him. Not with questions, not with interrogations, but with proclamations. They told him of the Imperium's decay, of worlds where the Astra Militarum fought and died for rulers who never remembered their names, of planets left to wither because the light of the Astronomicon could not reach them. They told him his brothers were not noble, but tools, and that he was the most valuable tool of all, for in breaking him, they broke the symbol of what humanity believed invincible. Their voices slithered into his ears, oily and persistent, clinging to him long after they fell silent. But though their words gnawed at him, his silence remained unbroken. A Space Marine's tongue was not for confession, but for the Emperor's praise and the chapter's oath. He let them speak, let them spit their blasphemies, but he gave them nothing in return. His silence was the only weapon left to him, and he wielded it with all the strength he had. Still, silence could not stop the doubt that slowly coiled within. He could endure pain without flinching, but when they left him in the dark, alone with nothing but the sound of his own pulse and the weight of chains, questions stirred unbidden. What if they spoke truth? What if his brothers had indeed been forgotten, their sacrifice erased from history before the ashes had cooled? What if his chapter never learned of his fate? What if he simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the Imperium, not dead, not alive, but erased? That thought, more than any blade, threatened to break him. To be forgotten. To be unrecorded. To fight and suffer, and yet to leave no mark. The cycle resumed. The restraints tightened once more. The instruments gleamed again. And as the first blade kissed his flesh, he closed his eyes and summoned the memory of his initiation, when the chaplain's Crozius had touched his brow and his oaths had bound him to the emperor forever. That memory was his fortress. And though the torment would never end, he clung to it with every fragment of will that remained. The anatomy of captivity was not measured in wounds or chains. It was measured in how long a soul could endure without splintering. They did not always torment him with steel. Sometimes their cruelty was quieter, more insidious, and for that reason far more dangerous. They learned quickly that a space marine's body was not easily broken, that pain was a language he could withstand for eternity. So they turned their focus elsewhere. They began to play with his senses, twisting sight, sound, and smell into weapons that cut deeper than blades. They flooded the chamber with incense that was not incense, vapors that crawled into his lungs and burned with chemical fire. At first he thought it poison, but his enhanced organs filtered it, fought it, resisted it. Only later did he realize its purpose was not to kill him but to weaken the grip of his mind. Under its haze, he saw things that could not be real. He saw his chapter master standing in the chamber, gazing upon him not with pride, but with disappointment. He saw the walls of the fortress monastery, but the Aquila had been torn down, replaced with symbols of the dark gods. He saw his brothers marching past, and every one of them bore the scars of mutation, their armor twisted into grotesque forms, their voices chanting praises not to the emperor but to his enemies. Each vision clawed at him. Each one whispered, "This is truth, this is the future, this is what you serve." He knew they were lies. He recited litanies until his throat bled, grinding prayers through clenched teeth, whispering oaths against the tide of visions. But lies repeated with enough weight begin to press against even the strongest walls, and he felt cracks form in the bastion of his certainty. The sounds were worse. They filled the chamber with voices, but not always the guttural chanting of cultists. Sometimes he heard the cries of civilians begging for aid. Sometimes he heard the death screams of guardsmen he had once fought beside, echoing as though he stood again on those battlefields. Once, he heard his own voice, cold, dispassionate, reciting blasphemies he had never spoken. He fought it, he denied it, he roared until his captors recoiled. But the sound lingered, curling in the corners of his thoughts long after the chamber had fallen silent again. In his moments of half-consciousness, drifting between pain and exhaustion, he wondered if the whispers were not only trickery. What if his brothers truly were corrupted? What if, somewhere beyond these walls, the fortress monastery had already fallen? The Imperium was vast, and wars flared and died across it every moment. Was it so unthinkable that his chapter could perish while he languished here? And if they did, what was he? A relic without purpose. A vessel of secrets with no one left to guard them. His captors knew this. They leaned upon it with the precision of blades. "You are alone," they said, their voices slick as oil. "You are forgotten. Your chapter has no need of you. The Imperium has no need of you. But we have use for you." He refused them, but refusal grew harder each day. His body was scarred, but still strong. His spirit was scarred as well, and those wounds did not heal. He feared them more than the knives. Yet still, a spark endured. One image they could not corrupt, one memory that returned to him no matter how they poisoned his senses. It was not of his master, or his fortress, or even his brothers. It was of his first oath, when he had been raised from neophyte to Astartes, when his name had been spoken aloud in the sanctum of his chapter for the first time. That moment burned in his memory, untouchable, uncorrupted. He clung to it, repeating his name in silence as though it were a weapon. For in that name was his link to the emperor, to duty, to everything that had made him what he was. The tormentors could twist his flesh. They could desecrate his armor. They could flood his senses with lies. But they could not take his name from him. Not yet. And so the cycle continued, each round of cruelty more refined than the last, each silence deeper than the one before. The anatomy of captivity was no longer just wounds or restraints. It was the slow erosion of certainty, the war for the soul that raged in the spaces between screams. And though he still endured, he knew the enemy had endless time. The chamber became his universe. There was no day, no night, only the repetition of pain, silence, and whispers. He did not know if weeks passed or months, only that his body was not permitted to die. They would not allow it. Every time blood loss weakened him to the edge of darkness, they poured vile concoctions into his veins, igniting his organs with artificial vitality. Every time exhaustion dragged him toward the oblivion of sleep, shocks of energy pulled him back, wrenching his body into wakefulness. Death would have been release. Sleep would have been mercy. Both were denied. He began to understand the cruel artistry of his captivity. It was not random. It was a design. They studied him the way a scribe studies a text, line by line, probing, cataloging, dissecting. He realized that even his defiance was not meaningless to them, it was a data point, a variable in their endless equations. His silence was not victory, but another note in their litany of desecration. Even his endurance was stolen, transformed into proof that they had captured something rare, something extraordinary, something worthy of the gods they served. One day, if it could be called a day, the robed figure returned with something new. In his gloved hand he carried a data slate, but not of imperial make. Its screen glowed with a sickly light, and upon it danced images the Marine recognized with horror. It was his chapter. Not illusions, not warped visions born of incense, but records, images of battles fought, of victories won, of oaths sworn upon battlefields the Marine remembered. He saw his brothers, proud and resolute, banners snapping in the wind. For a heartbeat, he thought salvation had come, that they had found him, that his chapter had endured. Then the images changed. The banners burned. The fortress monastery fell. His brothers were shown dying in grotesque mockeries, their armor twisted into spikes and horns, their bolters vomiting flame against the imperial Aquila. He saw their faces, and worse, he saw his own. His likeness, rendered in profane detail, standing among them, his armor painted in the colors of the damned. The robed figure leaned close, his vox grill spitting static as he whispered, "This is your future. This is your destiny. You will fight again, but not for him." The Marine bared his teeth, blood dripping down his chin as he spat onto the slate. He forced his voice to rise, ragged and raw, the first sound he had made in captivity. "I will never be yours." The chamber froze. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the thrum of machinery. Then laughter erupted, harsh and triumphant, as though his defiance was not defeat for them, but victory. They wanted him to speak. They wanted him to break his silence. They wanted him to believe his own words mattered. And in that moment, he understood the depth of their cruelty. Even his hatred was fuel for them. When they left him alone again, the silence was worse than before. His voice still echoed in his skull, that single sentence reverberating in the emptiness. He had sworn his refusal, and yet the vision lingered, the image of himself clad in the colors of corruption, fighting not for the emperor but against him. He repeated his name in his mind, clung to it as an anchor, but the doubt returned, heavier now, as though his captors had implanted it within his very veins. The anatomy of captivity was complete. They did not merely chain his body. They did not merely bleed him, or probe him, or carve him open. They had pierced something deeper. They had sown a seed. And in the darkness of his cell, as the echoes of their laughter faded, the Marine feared that one day, one endless cycle from now, that seed might grow. The body can be broken, and still endure. Bones can mend, organs can adapt, and the flesh of a space marine is designed to survive what would annihilate any mortal man. But the mind is a battlefield far more treacherous, and no amount of genetic perfection can shield it from the relentless tide of captivity. In time, the chains that bound his wrists became less oppressive than the chains that coiled within his thoughts. At first, his mind had been his fortress. He filled it with litanies, with the hymns of his chapter, with the words of the emperor's servants. Each line was a brick, each memory a wall, and within those walls he kept the invaders at bay. He recited the litany of endurance until his throat cracked, whispered the catechism of hate until the words were little more than breath. Even when silence was demanded of him, he spoke within himself, refusing to let his thoughts fall quiet. But cracks formed. They always do. And through them, the enemy crept. It began in dreams, or what he thought were dreams. When the chemical fumes or blood loss dragged him down into unconsciousness, visions rose to meet him. He stood again in battle, bolter in hand, but his enemies bore his brothers' faces. He struck them down, one after another, their blood splattering across his armor. He tried to deny it, tried to tell himself it was false, but the weight of the bolter, the heat of the shells, the cries of his brothers, every detail was too sharp, too real. When he woke, his gauntlets were clenched as though he had truly fired. Other times, he dreamed of home, of the fortress monastery carved into the mountains of his chapter's world. He walked its halls, the banners of past victories fluttering above him. But when he looked closer, the names inscribed upon those banners were gone, replaced with words he could not read, characters that shifted like worms upon parchment. The statues of his premarch wept blood, and in the chapel, the Aquila was gone. When he raised his head to the altar, it was not the emperor who sat upon the throne, but a shadow crowned in horns. He told himself these were lies. He knew they were lies. But repetition is its own weapon. The same vision seen 100 times wears away the certainty of denial. The fortress walls of his mind groaned with the weight pressing upon them. His captors fed these visions with careful cruelty. They left him long enough in silence that his imagination grew restless, then returned with whispers that matched the dreams. "Do you see them fall?" they asked. "Do you see the truth that waits for you?" They told him of Astartes who had been taken before him, who had bent, who had broken, who had risen again not as sons of the emperor but as champions of the dark gods. They spoke of the Luna wolves who had become the sons of Horus, of the blood angels lost to the black rage, of the countless chapters whose names were now cursed. "You are not the first," they said. "You will not be the last." He denied them. Again and again, he denied them. His silence was iron, his defiance unyielding. Yet in the darkness, when they were gone and only his thoughts remained, their words returned. He wondered if perhaps others had been captured like him. He wondered if some had indeed fallen. He wondered if he would join them, not by choice, but by erosion, worn down like stone beneath water. One cycle, they brought something new, the voice of his chaplain. At first he thought it memory, rising unbidden to strengthen him. But the words were wrong. The voice spoke his name, urged him to renounce his oaths, promised him freedom if he abandoned the emperor. It was flawless in tone, perfect in cadence, every detail exact. Only the message betrayed it. He tried to shut it out, but the voice followed him even into his half-sleep, until he could not recall the true prayers without hearing them twisted by mockery. He began to doubt not just his captors, but himself. Could his mind truly be trusted, when it conjured lies so vivid? Could his memories remain pure, when they bled together with visions until truth and falsehood shared the same edge? He remembered the face of his chapter master, but in memory it twisted, reshaped itself into the sneering visage of the robed tormentor. He remembered the banners of victory, but they burned before his eyes, no matter how hard he tried to hold them steady. In the end, he came to realize the truth his captors already knew, that the body of a space marine is steel, but his mind is clay. And clay can be reshaped. There were moments when he did not recognize himself. He would look down at the pale wreckage of his body, scarred flesh beneath torn armor, hands bound in iron, and wonder if he was still the warrior who had once stood proud upon battlefields, the roar of a bolter thundering in his grip. That marine seemed like another man, another life. In this place, he was something lesser, something stripped. And the worst part was the whispering thought that maybe his captors were right, maybe this was the truth of him, and the battlefield had been the lie. Once, they left him in darkness for so long that his sense of self began to fray. He tried to keep count of his heartbeats, but they blended into an endless rhythm. He tried to replay every battle he had fought, every victory his chapter had won, but the details bled away, dissolving until only fragments remained. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with brothers, but not their names. He remembered his war gear, but the details twisted. Bolter became plasma, plasma became blade, blade became something alien and wrong. When the light finally returned, he had no idea how long he had been lost, and part of him feared that some pieces of memory were gone forever. The tormentors seemed to know. They returned that cycle with grins hidden beneath their masks, as though they could smell his confusion. One leaned close and whispered, "You are forgetting. You are erasing yourself. Soon, there will be nothing left but what we choose to place in you." He wanted to roar, to deny, to spit words of hate into their faces. But the words caught in his throat. Because, in that moment, he could not summon the names of his battle brothers. He could not recall the shape of his chapter's banner. He could not even remember the face of his own father, the man he had been before the gene seed transformed him. The absence was more painful than any blade. It was annihilation of a kind no weapon could inflict. And in that void, something new began to take root. Whispers not his own began to fill the silence where memory once lived. Thoughts of power, of freedom not through endurance but through surrender. Fleeting flashes of himself clad in armor not of the Emperor's light, but of darker hues, spiked and jagged, wreathed in symbols he could not banish from his sight. He tried to force them out, but his mind, starved, wounded, hollowed, clung to them as though they were truth. This was the shattering, subtle and complete. Not the breaking of bones, not the tearing of flesh, but the fracturing of certainty. He was not yet lost. But the ground beneath his soul was crumbling, and the abyss waited eagerly for him to fall. He began to speak to himself, though at first only in whispers, the barest rasp of sound escaping dry lips. Not prayers now, not litanies, but his own name, spoken again and again like a desperate talisman. Each repetition was an anchor, a reminder that he still existed, that he was not merely a hollow shell for their lies. Yet even that weapon dulled with time. The sound of his name became strange, detached, as though he were reciting the identity of a stranger. The syllables grew brittle, hollow, no longer filled with certainty but trembling with doubt. The visions adapted to this weakness. He dreamed now not of battles corrupted or statues defiled, but of himself, himself as he could be, himself as his captors wanted him to be. He saw a figure in blackened plate, walking among war bands who bowed their heads in reverence. He felt power in his veins, not borrowed from drugs or torment, but alive, burning, endless. He saw himself standing on a mountain of broken Imperial Guard corpses, a king of ruin, his name spoken with awe and fear across the void. When he woke, his skin crawled with shame, but part of him still trembled with the echo of that power. That was the most dangerous cruelty of all. Not the chains, not the silence, not even the lies, but the temptation. They did not only want to break him, they wanted him to hunger. To desire. To reach willingly for the gift they promised. He resisted, but resistance grew heavier each time the visions returned. He thought of his brothers and wondered if they would condemn him for even seeing such things. He thought of his chapter master and feared that, were he here, he would already strike him down for the weakness creeping into his soul. But above all, he feared the Emperor's gaze, feared that his light had already turned away, leaving him to rot in this pit as punishment for some unspoken sin. His captors never spoke of salvation. They never offered him release. They promised only one thing, transformation. And in his darkest moments, when the silence stretched too far and his memories withered into ash, he wondered if perhaps transformation was all that remained for him. The mind, once shattered, can be rebuilt. But not always into the same shape. There came a moment when he no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming. The chamber, the chains, the smell of rust and blood, these were constants, yet they shifted at the edges, as though painted on glass and warped by unseen hands. He would blink and see the walls ripple with faces, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes tracking him wherever he turned. He would close his eyes and still see them, imprinted on the inside of his skull like brands. His mind fractured in ways he could not measure. He remembered battles that had never happened, wars fought against enemies who did not exist, campaigns waged across worlds that crumbled to ash in the instant he tried to hold their names. Once he recalled standing beside Horus himself, a brother in arms, only to realize the memory was a lie, a poison injected into the marrow of his thoughts. Another time, he was certain he had seen Gilliman kneel before a shadow crowned in fire, his voice breaking as he begged for forgiveness. He tried to banish these visions, to tell himself they were fabrications, but the lines between truth and falsehood blurred until both felt equally hollow. He began to question everything. Was he truly a space marine? Was he truly a son of the Emperor, or just a puppet of some ancient scheme, designed only to suffer, to fight, to bleed until something greater consumed him? Perhaps his captors were right, perhaps this was always his fate, to fall, to change, to serve powers older and more real than the distant golden figure on Terra. And yet, even in his shattered state, some part of him clung to a fragment of defiance. Not because he was certain of it, not because he still believed without doubt, but because it was all he had left. He spoke his name again, though it sounded weak, broken, like the echo of a man already dead. He whispered the Emperor's name too, though each syllable tasted of rust and ash. He did it not because he believed, but because the alternative was silence, and silence would mean surrender. Still, he felt the change working within him. Every whisper of doubt, every vision of corruption, every hollowed memory, they were cracks, and through those cracks something seeped, slow but unstoppable. The enemy did not need him to fall in a single instant. They needed only to let the weight of eternity press down upon him, until one day, perhaps soon, he would no longer resist. The mind was shattered. The only question that remained was what would rise from its ruins. The silence of his cell did not last forever. It never did. Silence was only a tool, a prelude to what always followed. One cycle, when the chamber's machinery stirred and the stench of blood and rust thickened the air, his tormentors did not return with blades or false images. They came instead with song. At first it was faint, a low murmur reverberating through the walls, impossible to place. The Marine thought it might have been his own mind, conjuring echoes again. But the sound grew, swelling into a chorus of voices. They did not chant in unison, nor in any language he could fully understand. Some syllables were harsh, others soft, some guttural, others sibilant, and yet together they formed a harmony that resonated deep within his chest. It was not beautiful, not truly, but it carried weight, gravity, a presence that pressed upon him with the weight of 1,000 planets. The words seemed to claw at his memory, forcing him to recall stories he had heard as a neophyte, forbidden tales murmured by older brothers when no chaplain was near. The dark gods, they had said, were not myths. They were not lies invented to frighten the faithful. They were real, and they whispered in the cracks of the galaxy, calling to mortals and Astartes alike. He had dismissed those words then, reciting catechisms to cleanse his mind. And yet, here in this pit, shackled and humiliated, his body mutilated and his mind torn open, the promise of freedom rang like the tolling of a distant bell. He tried to imagine what it would mean. Freedom from the chains that cut his flesh. Freedom from the endless cycle of torment. Freedom from the silence and the whispers. Perhaps even freedom from the burden of being Astartes, of carrying a weight that had never been his choice to bear. But he knew the truth. This was not freedom they offered. It was another chain, gilded, barbed, invisible but no less binding. He had been warned of it since the first days of his initiation. Chaos never liberates, it consumes. The gods do not grant, they take, and leave only ruin. Still, the whisper pressed closer. It did not argue. It did not lecture. It only asked, again and again, until the question was no longer foreign, but familiar. Until it seemed less like an intruder's voice, and more like a thought that had always belonged to him. "Do you wish to be free?" He roared his denial, the sound scraping raw from his throat, echoing off the chamber walls. His captors watched, silent, their masked faces unreadable. Perhaps they expected it. Perhaps they welcomed it. Perhaps his defiance was part of the path they had laid for him, each refusal only pulling him deeper toward the moment of collapse. When his voice died and the chamber fell silent again, the whisper did not leave him. It lingered, patient, eternal. And for the first time, he began to wonder if it would ever leave him at all. He remembered when silence had once been his ally. On the battlefield, it was a gift. Between the thunder of bolter fire and the shriek of chain blades, there were always moments, brief, fleeting, in which silence fell, and in that silence he found clarity. Orders spoken crisp and sharp, the crackle of the vox clear, the emperor's will made manifest through action. But here, silence was no longer his companion. It was the canvas upon which the whisper painted itself, filling every corner of his thoughts until there was no room left for his own. "Do you wish to be free?" The words threaded themselves into everything. He would close his eyes and hear them in the rhythm of his heartbeat. He would stare at the chains and see them etched into the metal links, the letters shimmering faintly as though branded by heat. Even when his captors returned and resumed their rituals of torment, he could hear it beneath their chanting, woven into the cadence like an undercurrent. It was no longer a voice outside himself. It was a voice within, subtle and patient, waiting. He tried to recall the faces of his brothers again, but where once there had been certainty, now there was only blur. Their names escaped him, their armor colors faded in memory, their deeds bled together into a haze. And always, beneath it, that single promise. Freedom. The question began to mutate, shifting in meaning. No longer only freedom from chains, but freedom from obedience. Freedom from sacrifice. Freedom from the endless grind of war that defined every breath of his existence. What was he, if not a weapon wielded by hands far away on Terra, discarded when dulled, forgotten when shattered? Was that duty? Or was that slavery, painted in the colors of loyalty? The thought horrified him. He struck it down as soon as it rose, grinding his teeth, forcing himself to mouth the emperor's name until the taste of it burned his tongue. But even in that, the whisper lingered. It did not mock him. It did not rage. It only waited. Patient, eternal, inevitable. When the tormentors left him once more in the dark, he found himself speaking aloud, though his voice was cracked and hollow. "I am his. I am his." The words trembled, fragile as glass, and somewhere inside, he feared they no longer rang true. The gods do not shout. They do not demand. They whisper, and they wait. Sleep became the most dangerous battlefield of all. His body, though brutalized, still demanded rest, and when exhaustion finally dragged him down, the whisper followed him into dreams. But in dreams it was no longer only a voice. It became shape, color, presence. He stood upon a plain of ash, the sky a swirling wound of crimson and gold, and there before him loomed figures vast beyond comprehension. He could not gaze upon them fully, each time he tried, his vision split and blurred, as though his eyes were not meant for such truths. Yet he felt them, each one radiating a different tide of power. Rage like wildfire, rot like fertile soil, laughter like breaking glass, hunger like a black hole that pulled at the marrow of his bones. And beneath them all, the question pulsed. "Do you wish to be free?" The Marine fell to his knees, not in worship, but in weight. The sheer presence of them crushed his will as though he were nothing more than dust. He tried to rise, to deny them, to spit in their faces as he had done to his tormentors. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. Only silence. Only weakness. The gods did not rebuke him. They only watched. The one of blades stretched its arms wide, a storm of steel inviting him into its embrace. The one of wrought whispered promises of peace, of an end to the ceaseless struggle, of a rest that would never again be stolen. The one of laughter danced in circles, offering release from chains through madness. And the one of hunger loomed silent, endless, inevitable, a shadow that promised only union in oblivion. He awoke gasping, his chest heaving, sweat and blood mingling on his skin. The chamber was dark, empty, silent. But he could still feel their gaze. Still hear the echo of the question in his veins. He knew then that captivity was no longer confined to iron chains and locked doors. He carried it within him, in his own mind, in his own heart. His body was still bound in the dungeon of his captors, but his soul had already been brought to the edge of another prison. And perhaps, without even realizing it, he had already stepped across the threshold. Choice. It was a word he had thought long buried, long meaningless. A space marine does not choose. From the moment of his initiation, his life had been dictated by the Emperor's will, by the decrees of his chapter, by the endless wars that lit the stars like pyres. Duty was the marrow of his bones, obedience the pulse in his veins. Yet now, in the cold darkness of captivity, that old certainty had withered. In its place grew something dangerous, the illusion of choice. The whisper had not left him. It had grown quieter, more intimate, no longer an external presence pressing against his skull, but something softer, more insidious, something that felt like his own thought. Do you wish to be free? The words no longer came like a command. They came like a memory, as though he himself had once spoken them, and now only repeated what he already knew. He tried to banish it with prayer, but the litanies rang hollow, brittle fragments of words stripped of meaning. He tried to anchor himself with memory, but memory was frayed and broken, his brothers' faces half forgotten, his chapter's banner little more than smoke. The Emperor's light seemed impossibly far away, a star swallowed by the endless void. And in that void, the question shone brighter than all else. What was freedom? To tear away these chains? To end the torment that had no end? Or was freedom something greater, a release not only from his captors but from the very weight of who he was? No more battles fought in the Emperor's name, no more obedience to orders carried across the void from distant Terra, no more sacrifice demanded again and again until nothing remained. The gods promised him freedom not as a prisoner, not as a soldier, but as himself, or what they would make of him. And that was the abyss. For the first time in all his centuries of service, he felt the pull of possibility. It was not the promise of survival, not the instinct to endure. It was something far more perilous, the temptation of change. He measured his breath as though it were the only thing still his own. Inhale, exhale, the rasp of air drawn past cracked lips and broken teeth. That rhythm was all he had left to count, all he could claim as certainty. But even that was fragile, for with every breath came the whisper, folded into the act itself. Freedom. Inhale. Choice. Exhale. Do you wish to be free? The cadence never broke, never faltered, never tired. It was eternal, and it was inside him. He tried to recall the meaning of loyalty, but the word felt abstract, heavy with expectations he no longer understood. Once, loyalty had been a brother's hand dragging him from the mud, the roar of a battle cry shared across Vox, the press of armored shoulders against his in the shield wall. But those memories were tattered now, blurred into smoke. Their voices no longer reached him, and when he tried to summon their names, silence answered. Was loyalty still loyalty when no one remained to receive it? The abyss deepened with that thought. It offered a new answer, loyalty to the self. To endure not because it was commanded, but because he willed it. To fight not because another decreed it, but because he chose to. Was that heresy? Or was it truth long buried beneath chains of doctrine and obedience? The gods knew where to strike. They offered not oaths, not decrees, not scripture, but a mirror. They showed him what he already felt, the fatigue, the despair, the endless weight of being a weapon without end. They promised freedom not by remaking him, but by unbinding him. What if he could still be warrior, still be strong, but no longer for them? No longer for the emperor, but for himself? He shook until the chains rattled, his body torn between denial and desire. He told himself this was the trap, the final cruelty, the lie that would damn him if he embraced it. Yet in the hollow of his mind, stripped of faith, stripped of certainty, he felt the seed of that question root itself deeper than any prayer had ever reached. Do you wish to be free? And for the first time, he did not answer. The chains rattled once more, but this time not from struggle. He sat still in the silence, the cold of the chamber pressing into his flesh, the taste of iron thick upon his tongue. For so long he had defined himself by denial, by what he was not, by what he would never become. Yet denial was no longer enough. The abyss waited before him, vast and endless, and his own reflection stared back from its depths. He was not broken, not yet. But neither was he whole. The whisper did not rise again. It did not need to. Its work was done. The question was no longer a voice pressed upon him, but a seed within, planted deep in the marrow of his soul. It would grow in silence, in darkness, watered by doubt and nourished by memory's slow decay. Perhaps it would bloom into surrender, and he would rise as something unrecognizable, a warrior of a new master. Perhaps it would wither, and in its death he would find strength renewed, his faith reforged by the fire of torment. He did not know. That was the true fate of the captured space marine, not death, not pain, not even corruption, but uncertainty. To linger forever upon the threshold, torn between duty and desire, between the emperor's light and the whispering abyss. His captors knew it. The gods knew it. And now, so did he. And in that chamber of rust and shadow, where time itself had no meaning, the universe held its breath, waiting for the answer he had not yet given. Do you wish to be free? And for the first time, he did not answer. The chains rattled once more, but this time not from struggle. He sat still in the silence, the cold of the chamber pressing into his flesh, the taste of iron thick upon his tongue. For so long he had defined himself by denial, by what he was not, by what he would never become. Yet denial was no longer enough. The abyss waited before him, vast and endless, and his own reflection stared back from its depths. He was not broken, not yet. But neither was he whole. The whisper did not rise again. It did not need to. Its work was done. The question was no longer a voice pressed upon him, but a seed within, planted deep in the marrow of his soul. It would grow in silence, in darkness, watered by doubt and nourished by memory's slow decay. Perhaps it would bloom into surrender, and he would rise as something unrecognizable, a warrior of a new master. Perhaps it would wither, and in its death he would find strength renewed, his faith reforged by the fire of torment. He did not know. That was the true fate of the captured space marine, not death, not pain, not even corruption, but uncertainty. To linger forever upon the threshold, torn between duty and desire, between the emperor's light and the whispering abyss. His captors knew it. The gods knew it. And now, so did he. And in that chamber of rust and shadow, where time itself had no meaning, the universe held its breath, waiting for the answer he had not yet given. And in that chamber of rust and shadow, where time itself had no meaning, the universe held its breath, waiting for the answer he had not yet given.